Welcome to our podcast, where we dive into the fascinating world of animals. We cover it all: wildlife conservation and unique species to ethical care practices and animal behavior. Whether you're an animal lover, a pet owner, or just curious about the natural world, join us for insightful discussions, expert interviews, and fun facts about the creatures we share our planet with. Please tune in and discover something new about the incredible animals surrounding us.
Ready to dig into animal breeding? We're going to break down how those top-notch animals, the prize-winning cows, those super fast racehorses, how those are made.
It's kind of like, baking when you think about it.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to check out the ingredients, the recipe for nailing animal breeding, but we're swapping out the flour and sugar for, genes and data.
Okay, now you're speaking my language. And our guidebook for this deep dive is Animal Breeding Methods by L.R. Schaeffer. So these course notes, they're giving us that behind-the-scenes look at how breeders actually, work their magic.
Exactly. It all starts with really careful data collection, that birth dates, weights, racing times for horses, milk yields, anything you can measure in an animal, really.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that all those numbers, they hold the secrets to an animal's genetic potential.
So like a detective, but instead of fingerprints, we've got spreadsheets of genetic code.
Exactly. And just like a good detective needs a system, breeders need their data standardized. That's where ICAR comes in, the International Committee on Animal Recording.
ICAR, so that's the International Bureau of Animal Records. Why is it so important to make sure that data is comparable, across different countries?
Well, think about it. Dairy bull semen. It's sold all over the world. Imagine trying to compare a bull from France with one from the U.S. if their data's all over the place.
Okay, yeah, that'd be a mess. So standardized data is the foundation. What's the next step in building, our prize-winning animal?
Well, for a long time, breeders used what's called the infinitesimal model. Imagine trying to understand a whole painting, but you're stuck looking at each tiny brushstroke individually.
Okay, so like a super detailed, pointillist painting where each dot matters.
Yeah, exactly. They thought tons of tiny genes were contributing to one desirable trait.
So breeding the perfect cow was like painting a Mona Lisa of genetics with tons of tiny details.
Exactly. But just like in art, sometimes you have those big, bold strokes. That's where major genes come in. These genes had a huge impact on very specific traits.
So we're not just blending subtle shades anymore. We're talking about those vibrant pops of color. Now things are getting interesting. But how do breeders keep track of all this genetic info across generations?
That's where estimated breeding values come in. EBVs for short.
EBVs, those are like a genetic report card, right?
Exactly. It predicts an animal's genetic potential. We look at its performance, its relatives, any genetic info we have.
So say I'm breeding dairy goats and I want them to have super high protein in their milk. How would EBVs help me with that?
You track the protein in their milk over several generations, right? Using that, you can calculate EBVs for each goat's protein yield. Those with higher EBVs, they're more likely to pass on those good genes for higher protein to their kids.
So over time, the average protein in my goat herd would go up if I keep using those high EBV goats? It's selectively breeding basketball players to be taller?
Exactly. But it's not just about picking the highest EBV every time. Things like heritability, selection intensity, even the generation interval, those all matter too.
Okay, let's break those down. Heritability, that's how much of a trait comes from genes versus the environment, right?
Exactly. Milk yield, for example, it's got high heritability, so you see genetic progress faster.
Mm-hmm.
Fertility, though, that's more about the environment, so it's trickier to breed for.
And selection intensity, that sounds like how picky a breeder can be, only choosing the cream of the crop.
Precisely. The more selective you are, meaning you only breed the absolute best animals, the faster you see those changes. But you also risk shrinking your breeding pool too much.
So it's a balancing act. Got to have enough genetic diversity to work with. What about that generation interval thing you mentioned?
That's just the average age of the parents when their offspring are born. Shortening it can speed things up, but comes with, trade-offs. For example, breeding bulls younger might mean relying on EBVs with less data, making them potentially less accurate.
Makes sense. The more info you have, the better your predictions. Speaking of history, let's talk pedigrees. Those family trees seem super important here.
Absolutely. They're key for understanding inbreeding. And like most things in life, it's got its pluses and minuses.
So inbreeding is like when you've got those big family reunions where everyone's like kind of related.
Exactly. You can concentrate those desirable genes, make more uniform populations, think about purebred dogs with their distinct looks, but you also risk those harmful recessive genes popping up, like shuffling a deck of cards but with fewer and fewer unique cards. You might get lucky, or you might get stuck with a bad hand.
So how do breeders measure that risk?
They calculate inbreeding coefficients, the chance that an animal inherits two copies of the same gene from, like a common ancestor. A higher coefficient means a higher risk.
And what happens when you've got gaps in the family tree, you know, those ancestors with no recorded info?
That's where phantom parent groups come in. Imagine you've got this dairy heifer, but you don't know who her mom was. Instead of just assuming she came from some random cow, you put her in this phantom group of possible moms from that time period.
That's so clever. So you're saying those unknown parents, they still matter genetically, even if we don't have all their info.
Exactly. It helps make those inbreeding coefficients and genetic evaluations more accurate, even with the missing pieces. Kind of like a detective filling in the blanks at a crime scene.
Okay, so we've got data, EBVs, pedigrees, it sounds like. The world of animal breeding involves a lot of number crunching. Before we dive into that, let's take a quick break. When we come back, I want to hear more about how breeders use all those stats to actually make their breeding decisions.
You know what they say, breeding those top-notch animals, it's part art, part science.
Right. Gotta have that creative spark.
And understanding those numbers, that's a big chunk of the science side.
Okay, hit me with those stats. What are we talking about here?
Well, we've got variance, covariance, correlation, any of those ringing a bell.
I'm getting some flashbacks to high school math class over here.
No worries, we'll keep it simple. Variance, think of it like measuring how spread out things are. If you're looking at, say, the height of a bunch of cows, high variance means you've got some really tall ones, some really short ones.
So low variance means they're all pretty much the same height, like a herd of clones.
You got it.
Ugh.
Covariance, that tells you how two things change together. Like, you'd expect a positive covariance between how much an animal eats and how much it weighs. The more they eat, the heavier they get.
That makes sense. What about correlation? How's that different?
Correlations are just like standardized covariance. Gives you a number between -1 and +1. 1 means they change together perfectly. -1 means they're always going in opposite directions. Helps us see how strongly those two things are related.
So if you told me there's a strong positive correlation between how much milk a cow produces and her EBV for milk yield, I guess those EBVs are doing a pretty good job.
You got it. Now, you also hear about that normal distribution, that bell-shaped curve. A lot of traits, like milk yield, how fast they grow, they tend to follow this pattern. Most animals are somewhere in the middle, not too high, not too low.
So even in the animal world, most individuals are just average.
Pretty much.
I guess it's those outliers, those at the edges of the curve that get the breeders excited, huh? But how do they actually use all these stats to make decisions?
It's all about building those mathematical models. They describe how different things like their breed, age, even the environment, how all those can impact an animal's traits.
So it's like a recipe. You tweak the ingredients depending on what you're trying to bake.
Exactly. And those models, they're always being refined. You get more data, learn more about how genes work with the environment. It's a never-ending quest for that perfect recipe for a prize-winning animal.
And speaking of recipes, let's go beyond the basics. What are some of those more like advanced things breeders have to consider?
Well, one of the most interesting is that animals, they change over time, right? They're not just frozen in time.
Okay, yeah, that seems kind of obvious.
But it means you can't just look at a snapshot of them at one point. We need to look at their whole performance history. We call them repeated records.
Give me an example. How would that work for, say, racehorses?
Well, a horse's times, they might get better with age. They get more experience, right? So you wouldn't just look at their fastest race ever. You'd look at their whole track record alongside their pedigree when deciding who to breed.
So it's like when you're scouting a basketball player. You don't just look at one good game, you look at their whole career.
Exactly. And another factor, the mother's influence. And I'm not just talking about the genes she passes down.
Wait, are you saying moms do more than just give their kids half their genes?
Absolutely. It's called maternal genetic effects. The environment she provides, even during pregnancy and early life, that can have a huge impact on things like birth weight, how fast they grow, even stuff that shows up later in life.
It's like those moms who make sure their kids eat a good breakfast every morning, sets them up for a better day, even if those kids aren't naturally morning people.
That's a great way to put it. It adds a whole other layer of, well, Complexity for breeders.
Speaking of complex, what about juggling multiple traits at once? Like, how do breeders even choose what to focus on?
It's like making a wish list, right? Like,
Yeah.
what's the ideal animal? You want a cow that produces a ton of milk,
Hmm.
or one with, like, really good udder conformation to prevent health problems. It gets tricky because some traits are genetically correlated.
So you're saying it's a trade-off. I might get that high milk yield, but the cow might have like weaker legs or be more prone to getting sick.
Exactly. And that's where multiple trait analysis comes in. Breeders use that to select for several traits at once, considering those genetic relationships between them.
So it's about breeding a well-rounded animal, not just one that's like amazing in one area but lacking in others. Like judging an Olympic gymnast on all the different events, not just how good they are on the uneven bars.
Exactly. And now, get ready for this, because we're entering the genomic era where things get really high-tech.
Okay, I'm picturing labs, DNA sequencers, the whole shebang. What's changed with this genomic revolution?
It's all about looking directly at the DNA. We can analyze an animal's whole DNA sequence now, identify specific genes, and those variations linked to the good stuff, those desirable traits.
So it's like having a roadmap for an animal's genes. You can zoom in on the exact spots that control, like growth rate, disease resistance, all that.
You got it. One of the big breakthroughs is genome-wide selection, GWS. It uses things called single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs.
SNPs. Okay, I've heard of those. Remind me, what are those again?
They're like tiny variations in the DNA sequence. But these variations, they can be linked to very specific traits. Think of them like little flags on a map, marking points of interest.
Okay, now I'm picturing a treasure map. And those SNPs are leading us to the genetic gold.
Exactly. And with tools like the Illumina 50K chip, we can analyze thousands of these SNPs at once. It's like having this super high-resolution snapshot of an animal's genes.
No more relying on those blurry family photos. We've got the DNA evidence.
Precisely. And using all this, we can calculate genomic estimated breeding values, or GEBVs.
So GEBVs are like EBVs, but like 2.0, supercharged with genomic data.
Exactly. Like upgrading from that old flip phone to the latest smartphone, you're getting so much more info, so much more accuracy.
But like any powerful tech, there's got to be some downsides. What are the challenges with all this genomic power?
One of the big ones, maintaining genetic diversity. As we get better at selecting for very specific traits, we risk narrowing that gene pool, which can have, unintended consequences down the road.
So it's like putting all your eggs in one basket. If something goes wrong, you're in trouble.
Exactly. It's so important to find that balance, maximizing those traits we want, but also making sure we're preserving enough diversity. Keep the population healthy and adaptable for the future.
It's incredible to think how far we've come. It's like going from reading those old encyclopedias to having the entire internet at our fingertips. What other fascinating stuff is hidden in those course notes?
Oh, glad you asked. Let's crack them open again, see what other treasures we can dig up.
Okay, this is interesting. It says that even with all this tech, those traditional breeding methods, they don't always account for things like, remember those maternal effects we talked about?
Ah, yes. The power of moms. It's especially important for those traits that are expressed really early on, like birth weight in beef calves, for example.
Right, because a calf's birth weight, it's influenced by its own genes and the genes of its mother. It's amazing how those maternal genes can, change the environment of the womb and have such a big impact.
Absolutely. And it just goes to show, breeders can't just focus on the individual animal. It's about the whole picture, the environment, even mom's influence. It all plays a role.
Okay, this next part is about those phantom parent groups again. Sounds like they're really important for filling in those gaps in the family tree.
Totally. This example's talking about dairy heifers and the age when they can first have calves. That's super important for, how efficient they are reproductively.
Right, because the sooner they can start producing milk, the better.
Exactly. But that age at first service, it's affected by genes and the environment. So when you've got a heifer with an unknown mom, those phantom parent groups, they're super helpful.
They help you estimate what that missing mom might have contributed genetically. Gives you a more accurate picture of that heifer's potential.
You got it. It's all about using the data you have to make the best decisions, even when you're dealing with, incomplete information. A bit like a detective piecing together clues from a crime scene.
Okay, this next bit is about those repeated records again. Seems like they're not just for racehorses, but for all sorts of traits.
Exactly. Think about dairy cows, for example. A cow's milk yield, it can go up or down throughout her lactation, and even from one lactation to the next. You don't get the full story from just one measurement.
So it's like judging a chef on just one single dish instead of their whole menu. You need to see what they can do over time.
Precisely. By looking at those repeated records, ideally over several lactations, breeders can get a much clearer sense of that cow's true potential.
And then use that to estimate breeding values for like different stages of lactation, like peak milk yield or even lifetime production. It's like analyzing an athlete's performance throughout their entire career.
Exactly. It's not just about those short-term gains, it's about that long-term view.
Okay, this part talks about multiple trait analysis again. It seems like it's a key strategy for creating those well-rounded animals we talked about.
Absolutely. This example is about breeding dairy cattle. You want high milk yield and good udder conformation.
Right, because you don't want a cow with like a massive udder that's prone to infections or other problems.
Exactly. But selecting for just high milk yield, sometimes that can lead to poorer udder conformation. It's a classic trade-off.
So how do breeders find that sweet spot, balancing those different traits?
That's where multiple trait analysis comes in. Breeders use it to make smart decisions, balancing those trade-offs, and breeding healthier, more productive animals. It's all about seeing the big picture.
Okay, this next bit mentions something called heterosis, or hybrid vigor. That sounds pretty intense.
It's pretty close. Heterosis is this cool phenomenon. You crossbreed animals, and often their offspring end up being even better than their purebred parents, like faster growth, better fertility, even better disease resistance.
So it's like combining the best of both worlds, getting the strengths of both breeds.
Precisely. Breeders have known about this for ages. But genomics, it's now helping us understand why it happens, the genetics behind it, and we can even start to predict which crosses will be the most successful.
So it's becoming less about trial and error and more about a precise science.
Exactly. Now, this next part talks about a challenge that comes with this crossbreeding, estimating breeding values for those crossbred animals.
Oh, right, because those traditional methods, they were designed for purebreds. So those calculations might not be accurate for crossbreds.
You got it. But luckily, scientists are coming up with new statistical models that are specifically designed for those complex genetics you get with crossbreds.
That's good to hear, especially since more and more farmers are turning to crossbreeding. It's great that we're getting better at managing it.
Exactly. Speaking of adapting to different situations, this next part is about something called genotype by environment interactions, or GXE interactions for short.
GXE interactions sounds a bit like a tech term. Break that down for me.
It basically means that an animal's genes, they might actually express themselves differently depending on the environment they're in.
So, like how some plants thrive in the sun while others prefer the shade.
Exactly. And it's a super important concept for breeders to keep in mind, especially with climate change and all. Things are getting less predictable, right?
So you're saying a cow that's perfectly suited for a farm in like a mild climate, she might not do so well on a farm in a really hot, humid climate.
You got it. Breeders, they got to consider those interactions to make sure they're developing animals that can thrive in all sorts of environments.
It's like choosing the right tool for the job. You wouldn't bring a snow shovel to the beach, right?
Exactly. Okay, check this out. Using genomic selection to boost disease resistance.
Now that's something everyone can get behind. How does that work?
So disease resistance, it's super complex. Lots of genes involved, plus environmental factors. But genomics helps us pinpoint the genes that matter most. And that lets breeders select for animals that are naturally more resistant.
So it's like breeding in natural armor against disease.
You got it. Think about it. Healthier animals, less need for antibiotics and meds. It's a win-win for everyone.
Okay, what's next in our journey through these notes?
Let's see, this part's about breeding for resilience.
Resilience, that's a good quality to have no matter who you are. What does that mean in the animal world?
Think of it like an animal's ability to roll with the punches, They can handle stress, whether it's crazy weather, changes in their food, even those disease outbreaks we talked about.
So resilient animals, they're like those friends who always seem to land on their feet no matter what life throws at them.
Precisely. They bounce back, keep on going. And as you can imagine, with all the challenges in agriculture these days, resilience is a highly sought-after trait.
I bet. But like other complex traits, it can't be easy to breed for, right?
You're right. It's influenced by a whole bunch of genes, plus the environment. But those genomic tools, they're helping us unravel those secrets. We're getting better at spotting those genetically resilient animals and using that to breed a more resilient future.
That's encouraging. And speaking of the future, this next part emphasizes something really important: animal welfare.
Couldn't agree more. It's easy to get caught up in all the sciencey stuff. But we can't forget about the animals themselves.
Right, it's not just about what we can do, but what we should do.
Exactly. We have to think about those potential downsides, unintended consequences, and make sure we're using this technology responsibly. It's a conversation that needs to happen alongside all the exciting scientific progress.
I totally agree. This next part talks about the importance of communication and collaboration, which seems really important for navigating all of this ethically.
Absolutely. Animal breeding? It's not a solo sport. We need breeders, scientists, industry experts, even consumers, all on the same page.
So it's about sharing knowledge, best practices, making sure everyone benefits from these advancements.
Exactly. Organizations like, breed societies, research institutions, they're vital for making that happen.
It's like we're all working on a giant puzzle, and we all have a piece to contribute.
I like that.
Okay, this last one has me really intrigued. It's about using artificial intelligence, AI, in animal breeding. Now that sounds seriously futuristic.
Now you're talking about the next frontier. Imagine this. AI algorithms, crunching mountains of data, spotting those hidden patterns we might miss, making predictions about an animal's genetic potential with incredible accuracy.
It's like having a supercomputer as your breeding consultant.
Exactly. And it's not science fiction, it's already happening. AI is being used to figure out the best mating pairs, predict outbreaks, even help choose which animals to use in breeding programs.
That's incredible. It really feels like we're on the verge of a whole new era in animal breeding. But with all this amazing progress, it's good to remember where we started.
You're absolutely right. At the end of the day, animal breeding, it's all about understanding nature, working with it to make life better for both animals and humans.
It's really amazing to think how much things have changed, even in just the last few decades.
Right. It's incredible.
We've gone from, just looking at animals and trying to guess to, actually looking at their DNA.
Yeah, it's like we've unlocked this whole secret code.
The blueprint of life, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
And the implications are huge.
It's huge. So this deep dive, all about animal breeding, what's the main takeaway for our listener? Someone who's not a farmer or a geneticist, why should they care about all this?
Because ultimately, every choice we make as consumers, what we buy at the store, it all connects back to this.
You're saying we're not just passive eaters, we're part of this whole system.
Exactly. And when you understand how it all works, it helps you make more informed choices.
So next time I'm at the grocery store, I should be thinking about the breeding decisions that went into my food.
Absolutely. That steak you see that represents generations of careful breeding, and knowing that breeders are out there striving for, both quality and animal welfare, it makes that meal even more satisfying, don't you think?
Oh, for sure. I know I'll never look at a carton of eggs the same way again.
Right.
But on that note, it feels like we've reached the end of our deep dive here.
We've covered a lot of ground, that's for sure.
From the basics of genetics to genomics, AI, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey.
And like any good journey, it leaves us with more questions than answers.
Always.
Which is a good thing, right? It means there's still so much more to learn.
Exactly. And that's what makes it all so fascinating. It's constantly changing, pushing the limits of what we thought was possible. But no matter how advanced the science gets, we can't forget that at its core, animal breeding, it's about that connection between humans and animals.
It's about respecting that bond, that ancient partnership, but using our knowledge to build a better future for both.
Well said.
And on that note, we'll leave you with this final thought. As we continue to unlock these mysteries of genetics, what role will you play in shaping the future of animal breeding?
That's a great question to ponder. Keep asking questions. Stay curious. Until next time.
See you then.